All right. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center Washington. I'd like to welcome all of you to this exciting panel on trying to unpack the Netanyahu re-election of last week and discuss maybe future implications, whether on the domestic Israeli scene, on the next door Palestinian scene, on the Arab scene, regional, if you will, and on the international scene. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the great panelists who are with us today. I'm not going to dedicate too much time because we would like to spend as much on discussion after their presentation. Their introductions are elaborate, and we're delighted that they're all here. I think we have a panel of 5 of the most credible people to discuss this issue in town and actually internationally. They're all well known in terms of Arab-Israeli and general Middle East knowledge and activism and what have you. They will be speaking in the order they are seated in, starting on my left here, all the way down to Phyllis. And I will make few remarks for just a couple of minutes, and then we'll open the floor with Amir Tibon from Haaretz discussing the domestic Israeli implications and government formation and what have you. Just by way of introduction, let me say that yesterday afternoon, for those of you who follow news from the region, the Israeli Election Committee or Commission issued the final results yesterday or last night. And we know that the results ended up being basically a tie, 35 seats each to the Likud and to Kahol Lavan, or blue and white, the party led by Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid. The rest of the seats were allocated as announced earlier. There were very few surprises in the results, aside from the 2 major parties getting 35 each. UTJ and Shas each got 8 seats. Labor and the Arab party, Hadash Ta'al, got 6 each. Rightist Union and Yisrael Betenu got 5 each. The Meretz and Kulanu got, and Balad got 4 each. So the results were as announced earlier, except, like I said, for the 2 major parties. As you know, the next step is very clear. The President of Israel has been consulting with all the elected candidates and the parties, and he reached a decision earlier today to go ahead and ask, he did ask Netanyahu today to go ahead and form his coalition, submit, if you will, the coalition. He has, I would say, about what, 28 days to come up with a government and get it passed. The president, if that doesn't work out, the president has the option of extending it another 14 days after that. But within that bracket, we're supposed to see some form of an Israeli government. And my understanding is that the president met with Netanyahu at what, 7 or 8 o'clock?
Just now before.
Just before we started to discuss the official kind of entrusting him with that job. The reason, of course, the president did that is because after consulting with all the elected parties, he got recommendations from 65 elected officials, members of the Knesset, to go ahead and invite Netanyahu to form the government. These are the people who are either Likud or supportive of Likud. The other 50 opposition plus people recommended some others. The Arab parties did not recommend anybody. So basically, the president had very little choice but to ask Netanyahu to do that. Now, when we look back at the results last week on April 9th, the Israeli elections actually did raise more questions than they really did answer. Whether you look at it from an Israeli perspective, Palestinian perspective, American Jewish perspective, Arab perspective in general, a lot of questions have been asked. The first question, of course, that we would like to tackle today is what's the next step? Now that the Israeli elections are over, now what? As a newsletter that I received today from my friend Hassan Jabbarin in Haifa from Adala asks that question. That's the title of their newsletter this week. The second one is, what type of coalition do we expect that Netanyahu would form? What role will the radical right play in this coalition? What role would the opposition, whether it's Labor or the Blue and White or Meretz, what type of role would they play in that government? Of course, the other question that we have also focused on at the center is, what role will the Arab bloc play, having lost at least 3 seats in this Knesset, the 21st Knesset. They had 13 before, now they have 10. There are 2 other Arab members affiliated with major Jewish parties that are also members of the Knesset, but the 10 elected as, if you will, Arab parties or the Arab bloc, will they have any significant role, whether in the coalition formation or subsequently in the conduct of governing in the country? Of course, the big kind of gorilla in the room, or $800 million question that has been asked in Israel and beyond is, will Netanyahu be still indicted? As we know, the charges or the threat to charge him with corruption on 3 different separate cases, that threat is still alive. What Israel is going through is a typical legal hearing at this time to give him a chance to defend himself before the public prosecutor and the attorney general, which he is doing, or his lawyers are doing, but of course they are trying to delay the process to avoid indictment. But will he be indicted, and should he be indicted, what's going to happen to this new government? Do you have a prime minister governing from jail? It will be kind of interesting to look at the prospects down the road. Will Mr. Netanyahu also fulfill the promises he made during the election campaign, and more recently even just after the election, particularly in terms of annexation? Will he annex the West Bank? Will he do that in light of the threat by people at the White House of releasing their so-called Middle East peace plan, or different names they keep giving it, the deal of the century and what have you? As a matter of fact, they had a meeting today, and maybe Amir would discuss, he was there. They were talking about that, and most probably decided to delay out of respect for Ramadan now. So they have to find excuses. You know, if it's not Ramadan, it's Passover. If it's not Passover, it's Christmas. So we're in at least till January of next year. I don't know. Where do the Palestinians stand? Are they, as they have threatened, ready to really kind of lock horns with this new government? And is the new government that was sworn in 2-3 days ago, headed by Mohammed Shtayi, is that government going to be able to function and to survive amid this tension? So these are the questions that we would like to kind of tackle and discuss today, ranging from, again, internal Israeli concerns all the way to U.S. policy and how the U.S. will proceed. May I mention a couple of logistical things? In terms of questions, we usually do written questions, so there are cards and pencils on your seats. So if you decide to ask a question, please address it to a specific speaker or to the whole panel, and indicate your name, your affiliation, and write your question clearly and succinctly so we can read it and read your name and your affiliation and have the panelists respond to it. The other one is we have a special publication in addition to the center's publication. Phyllis Bennis was gracious enough to bring copies of her Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. It's a primer, well done primer that has been updated with reference to some of these issues that we have to deal with these days in terms of Arab-Israeli affairs. If you would like to purchase a copy up front at the desk and have Phyllis sign it for you. She says it's going to be worth a lot less after she signs it, but it's the opposite, actually. So one day it'll be a collector's item, okay? Grab your copy and come and see Phyllis afterwards. So with that said, let's go ahead and start our conversation. Amir, go ahead.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks Khalil for the introduction and for the invitation to this panel. And thanks for everyone who made it here. It's such a beautiful spring day outside. Thank you for choosing to spend the next hour and a half with us. It's not obvious. Speaking about the results of the election, first of all, anyone who was following the news reports before the election, I think was not very surprised by what happened. We saw consistently in public opinion polling in Israel that the two big parties of this election, Likud and Blue and White, were getting a good result, sometimes, just under 30, sometimes just over 30, but it was clear these two parties will get a lot of seats in the Knesset, and eventually they both got 35. And at the same time, it was clear all along the way that the right-wing religious bloc will have more seats than the center-left bloc. I think there were maybe 2 polls during the entire election season that showed the opposite result, and even then it was really by 1 seat or less, not a significant shift. And so the final result we did get 65 seats for the religious right-wing bloc, 55 seats for the center-left bloc, should not come as a surprise to anyone. I do think, however, that for many in the Israeli left wing, the result of the election has served as a wake-up call. Not because of the fact that Netanyahu has another term and the right wing has more seats. I think people expected that, but because, in fact, the result is a bit of a lie, because 2 right-wing parties got significant level of support but fell beyond the electoral thresholds. In Israel, in order to have representation in the Knesset, a party needs to receive more than 3.25% of the total vote. And we had 2 religious right-wing parties that received just under that threshold, which means that actually, if the threshold was lower, the right-wing bloc would have been even bigger in the Knesset. At the same time, 2 left-wing parties, Meretz and Balad, which is Balad and Ra'am, which is a joint list of 2 Arab parties, one Islamist and one Arab nationalist and secular. They together, both, if we look at Meretz and Ra'am Balad, both of them passed the threshold really barely. And actually, in the case of Meretz, one of the interesting phenomena in this election is that Meretz was saved by Arab voters. Meretz, is one of the older left-wing parties in Israel. It actually has roots with Mapam party that goes back to the foundation of the country. And in this election, Meretz barely passed the threshold. And if it was not for a surprisingly strong showing for Meretz among Arab Israeli voters, we would not have any representation for them in the Knesset. So a scenario where the election ends when the right-wing religious bloc has 65, the center-left has 55, but 2 of the left-wing parties barely passed, and 2 right-wing parties just barely fell beneath the threshold, it served as a wake-up call for many people within the Israeli left, and an understanding that there has been a clear shift to the right wing, and that the religious parties are getting stronger in Israel. And every time some political side loses an election, obviously you have calls for to rethink our strategy and where have we gone wrong and what should we do better. But I do feel from conversations with friends in Israel that this time there is a deeper sense of hopelessness for many people, because they look at these trends and they say, well, how do you even begin to overturn this kind of situation? Whereas on the right wing, what I sense from talking to friends is really a feeling that their hold to power is irreversible. Now, there are shifts in politics and things change, but this is what I'm sensing from talking to friends and people within the political system in the week since the election, both in the right wing and in the left wing. If you do try to look for solutions, or people who are more optimistic and are already planning the next fight, there are 2 things that you can hear. One of them is within the left wing, there is a call for uniting the different left-wing parties into one big bloc. In this election, you had Labour Party having a very dismal result, 6 seats, the worst in the party's history. Meretz barely surviving, Balad and Ra'am barely passing the threshold. Hadash had a nicer result, but you have to remember Hadash ran together with Ta'al, the party of Ahmed Tibi, so even for them 6 seats is not wonderful. And like Khalil said, overall the Arab parties lost 3 seats. So there is a call for unity and for building maybe not all of these parties together, maybe not all of their members in Knesset, because you do have big ideological differences between some of the components, but trying to create as much as possible some kind of unity within the left wing. if only just to avoid the absurd situation when in the last 2 weeks of the election, instead of having the left-wing parties try to convince voters from the center or the right wing to switch to their side, all the left-wing parties do is encircle the same potential pool of voters and try to convince them, vote Meretz, not Hadash, vote Hadash, not Balad, etc., which is self-defeating. And when you talk about resources in politics, it just doesn't make any sense. It's not useful. So there is a discussion about doing that. And there is also, this has become a trend in the last week in the Israeli left, speaking more and more about Arab and Jewish partnership and saying that one of the main reasons for the failure of the left wing in this election was the low voting percentage within the Arab population. I've seen different numbers. I don't know there is no official kind of number for this because when you look at voting percentages, you can look at Arab towns and villages and cities, but then you have cities which are mixed, Jewish and Arab citizens, and you don't know how many of the votes were by Jewish residents, how many by Arabs. And so, but overall, I have seen different numbers that all indicate it was about around 50%, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but basically almost 1 in 2 Arab Israeli citizens did not vote in the election. This is a huge potential pool of voters. And if you look at the result, the 65-55 result, so you can make the argument that the only real centrist party that ran in this election, blue and white, received a very nice result. It's a party that was just formed a few months ago, has no real history, led by a political rookie, Benny Gantz, total amateur in politics. And you could see it during the campaign. He made an endless list of mistakes, and still he got to 35 seats, the same result as Netanyahu, very nice. But the huge drop was on the left. And if you combine all the left-wing parties, they have 20 seats. If they could get to 25 somehow, instead of having the result we have right now, we have a tie. And a tie means Netanyahu is no longer prime minister. So how do you get there? And a lot of people are saying, and I don't know if it's true, I'm not preaching any strategy right now, I'm kind of like, reporting to you what I'm hearing. But some people are saying the way to do it is to get many more votes in the Arab sector. And of course, it depends on a different kind of politics. It depends on these parties offering something that Arab voters can identify with and that will motivate people to go to the polls. Most of the, let's say, drop in the Arab vote has to do with younger voters who are cynical and don't believe that there's anything can change through this politics, feel unrepresented. And if you could somehow motivate and get them to the polls, it would be a different situation. Can it be done? How? I don't know. But this is one discussion that is going on. Another discussion that is developing, that is evolving within the center-left bloc, takes things in a totally different direction. And it's a discussion about accepting the fact that the liberal, secular, left-wing population in Israel is a minority, accepting the fact that Likud, together with the religious parties, has a strong hold on power, and trying to basically come up with a new strategy that says, just like you have ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties in Israel, and you have parties of the religious Zionist population, and you have the Arab parties, there also needs to be a party that represents the liberal, secular population and run as a kind of like the word I would look for in Hebrew is migzar. I'm not sure how to say it in English, but basically say we are a sector of the society. We run to represent our own interests. We can sit with anyone in the coalition. And what's important for us is to push for our own narrow interests, for example, to have secular education for our children and not have religious education dictated by the state, to talk about where our taxes go, things like that. Of course, these are two very different strategies that take the opposition in very different directions. And one of them builds on the fact that perhaps we can win, but it demands a big change. And I'm not sure everyone within the Zionist left wing are capable of what it would take in order to create this, excitement and enthusiasm within the Arab voting population. And the other takes it in a different direction, saying we're not going to beat Likud in the right wing, but we can still find a way to promote our interests, just like you have small other sectional, sectorial parties in Israel that do it. Which way will be chosen, I really don't know. And of course, a lot of it will also be impacted by what the government will do, because this coalition is going to be a direct continuation of Netanyahu's previous coalition. And it's going to be very right-wing, and the religious parties are going to have a lot of power within it. And I think what we should expect is, first of all, Khalil mentioned the legal troubles of Netanyahu. I believe this coalition will take steps to end that saga. They will either pass a law that gives him immunity or take other steps that will really weaken the legal system in Israel. And Netanyahu is already speaking about it openly. It's not a question, and I don't see anyone in this coalition who will stop him. In the previous coalition, we had one center-right party, the party of Moshe Kahlon, the finance minister, which had 10 seats. And because the coalition had, I think, 65 or 66, not a lot more than this one, his 10 seats made a big difference. Without him, there was no majority. And he took a principled stand of stopping many of these initiatives to weaken the legal system and to weaken the judiciary. He won 4 seats in this election, and he's already said he's not interested in fulfilling the same role in the next coalition. And then you look at Likud with Netanyahu leading the party and having his own trouble with the legal system. You look at the right-wing ultra-Orthodox parties that have been talking about changing the dynamic between the Knesset and the legal system for decades. This is going to happen. And anybody who is interested in Israel, cares about Israel, should look at it and be ready for the implications. I also think we will see steps that will, on the one hand, try to improve, if possible, economic situation within the Arab population in Israel. We already saw some of that with the previous government, but at the same time hurt the political representation and keep causing these wedge issues with the more radical elements within the Arab population in order to stop any, or decrease the likelihood of this joint Arab-Jewish left-wing coalition forming, because that is an electoral threat. And I think this is a deliberate calculation that says if we have better economic conditions within the Arab society, which I think is a good thing anyway, but at the same time we keep driving these more cultural and political wedge issues, we are basically reducing the possibility of this kind of alliance growing and challenging the government. So that's, in 10 minutes, kind of like an overview. And one last word I will say, some people speculated that maybe the Trump peace plan will somehow cause problems within Netanyahu's right-wing coalition and maybe even force him into a unity government because some of the smaller right-wing parties will not accept it. I'm highly skeptical. I don't think this peace plan will go far enough in any of the parameters to change the Israeli coalition or really challenge the Israeli right wing. I think the more interesting question is what will the Arab countries do? Because I think this peace plan will be tailored to Netanyahu's political needs, and it will test the question of, this is a question that's being debated in Washington and elsewhere, will the Arab countries actually say we cannot accept it because of these parameters, or will they say we are willing to go with it because it's important enough for us to have a better relationship with Trump and with Israel? So that's it.
Thank you, Amir. By the way, when a Palestinian helps an Israeli with regards to Hebrew, Migzar is sector, yes. the secular sector. Yes. Yes. All right, and now Nadia Hijab will be discussing the Palestinian perspective with regards to this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Khalil, for organizing, and thanks. Palestinians have long memories, and so my short presentation will go somewhat back in time. And I want to just discuss the impact of the elections on the Palestinians and its implications, both negative and positive, for the efforts to achieve a just peace, a just resolution of this conflict. Many in the US and Europe have turned a blind eye for decades to what Israel has been doing in the territories and to its growing embrace of the right wing and to its right wing trajectory, and as well as its discrimination against its own citizens. But when you look at it from a Palestinian perspective, Israel has been on this trajectory from the start, and it's just moving further and further along this trajectory. When the state was established, of course, as you remember, it was at the expense of the majority of the Palestinian people, and the remaining minority was put under military rule until '66. And within Israel, the land and rights of the Palestinians' citizens have continuously shrunk until this was codified, as it were, by the nation-state law last year. It's interesting if you look at it, how the tactics that were used in Israel before 1967 were then transferred to the occupied territories after 1967 in order to support the colonization there. So whether Israel formally annexes the West Bank, some or all of the West Bank or not, as it has already Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, this trajectory, to my mind, will continue and accelerate. And for the Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, life is just going to get much, much harder and much more dangerous. So not only do you have the Israeli army and the Palestinian security forces arresting, killing, and torturing Palestinians, the majority of them young men, many of them children, but now, and increasingly, you also have the settlers ramping up their attacks with immunity. It's quite terrifying to live in the West Bank. And life will be getting much more difficult in terms of movement and access now that you have this really solid right-wing government, very solid, very right-wing government. Life will get much more difficult in terms of movement and access, livelihood, waters, housing, and other basic rights, and we'll be seeing further evictions and home demolitions. The Supreme Court has just cleared the demolition of about 500 homes in East Jerusalem. And even in prison, things are going to get much harder. If you follow the news, of course, you've seen how prisoners are now rationed, have water rationed. And by the way, today is Palestinian Prisoners' Day, worth mentioning since we're here. My colleague and friend Diana Boutou, who was recently on a UK speaking tour where I usually am based, said what strikes her today as different from the past is the increasing cruelty in the treatment of Palestinians. So not a good scene overall. In Gaza, which has been declared to be on the brink, living under siege of becoming unlivable for so long that it's surprising there's no major epidemic wiping people out and sweeping the strip. There's been something of a reprieve in the last few days, which was helped by Benjamin Netanyahu for the sake of the elections. But this may continue if Gaza and Hamas find themselves forced to become a de facto Palestine just to physically survive. And it's said that that's part of it's been pushed as part of the discussions around the deal of the century. On the positive note is that Israel's elections have introduced a clarifying moment. There's a real clarifying moment. So it's ripped away the fig leaf once and for all of the peace process, that's kept the international community going for decades now. And several parts of the international community have responded with pleas to keep the two-state solution alive, not to take their fig leaf away. And if things weren't so horrible on the ground, there would be much to find humor in. For example, to have the four of the staunchest allies of Israel and supporters of AIPAC in Congress, Elliot Engel, Nita Lowey, Ted Deutsch, and Brad Schneider, issue a statement urging Israel to preserve, not actually achieve or push or promote a two-state solution, but preserve the eventual possibility of a two-state solution, and cautioning against unilateral steps to declare occupied Palestinian territory part of the State of Israel. Made me wonder if indeed this was a plea from AIPAC itself that, let's stay in business here and keep that fig leaf going so that we can do that. Now, so more and more reports are surfacing that the Trump plan will formally ditch the two-state solution, so several you've all read those reports about Jared Kushner's 4 freedoms that approach. So there's a bit of a panic amongst in Europe, as many of you probably saw. There were several former high-ranking officials in Europe, including 25 former foreign ministers, 6 former prime ministers, and 2 former secretary generals of NATO, had a letter in The Guardian effectively urging Europe not just to stand by the two-state solution, but to go it alone if the Trump deal abandons it. So there's this kind of desperation to keep that two-state solution going. And what was, for me, interesting about this letter was its emphasis about also protecting the system of international law that had brought the longest period of stability and prosperity to the continent, and putting Israel staunchly on the side of those who want to rip up that system. Well, the EU is facing too many challenges to really step up to the plate on this issue for the foreseeable future. And if they did, they would be unlikely to break away from bringing the two sides to the negotiating table, which has led us to where we were today, or even put a cost on Israel's occupation, which would be necessary for a two-state solution. So I just want to say that whatever hope there is for change, which I think there is here in the United States. Netanyahu is betting on Orthodox Jews, even though they're a minority of US Jews, as well as evangelical Christians. And he doesn't much care about the rest of the US Jewish community, which I personally think is a strategic mistake if you want to succeed in Israel. And a problem here is that everybody is pinning the issue or the trajectory of Israel to the right on Netanyahu personally. But and that if we could have got rid of Netanyahu and had Gantz, for example, things would be much better. But as I said earlier, this has been the trajectory from the beginning, and it's not surprising it's reached now. So I'll just conclude with a couple of points, which is that in addition to the response of the US Jewish community to what's happened in the elections, the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the US is currently much better resourced and organized than at any time in the past, and is very much part of an intersectional movement of Black, Native, Hispanic, and other Americans organizing for rights. And this movement is part of a larger movement that has been galvanized by the Trump administration and is organizing just for rights and against the administration. So I think we can say that perhaps the PEPs, the Progressive Except for Palestine, folks are becoming a thing of the past. The other thing is to achieve its annexationist goals, and this is my concluding point here. Israel is determined to, and has to, in fact, crush free speech and conflate criticism of Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism. This is much easier to do in Europe, and I can attest to that, being based there, because Europe is smaller and it's closer to the Holocaust. But it's much more difficult to do in the United States, where the attachment to free speech and rights is much stronger, and still and hopefully for much longer upheld by the law. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadia. Mouin will now take us a little bit further into the issue of annexationism as a policy in Israel, and particularly the U.S. role in that. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Khalil. I was asked to speak for 10 minutes, so I jotted down 11 observations on the recent Israeli elections, their context and consequences, which I hope will give me an extra minute. First, the April 2019 Israeli parliamentary elections consolidated a decisive shift in the Israeli body politic. From 1967 until roughly 2005, which not coincidentally coincided with the removal of Yasser Arafat and his replacement with Mahmoud Abbas, the fault line within Israeli elites in relation to the Palestinian people and the occupied territories was between, on the one hand, those who believed Israel's interests are best served through the indefinite perpetuation of the status quo, better known as creeping annexation, and on the other, those who advocated various forms of territorial compromise, primarily with Jordan, but later on with the PLO. Second, The 2019 elections demonstrate that the fault line within Israel has moved definitively to the right. It is today between those who advocate an indefinite perpetuation of the status quo, the creeping annexationists, and those promoting formal annexation of parts or all of the occupied territories. Let's call them the leaping annexationists. It is, however, worth noting that, in contrast to the period until 2005, in virtually all cases, the Gaza Strip is no longer on the Israeli territorial menu, at least not in the settler colonialist sense. Third, while Netanyahu has and never had any intention of relinquishing any occupied territory under any circumstances, and will make no concessions unless compelled to do so by overwhelming political and/or military force, I would nevertheless characterize him as a creepy, rather than leaping annexationist. This is because, unlike most of those to his right, Netanyahu understands that action speaks louder than words. His generally risk-averse character and fear of the international response previously led him to avoid openly advocating an annexationist agenda. Fourth, this changed decisively during the past 2 years, and the cause of this change is to be found primarily here in Washington. The Trump administration's open embrace of Israeli extremism pushed the Israeli mainstream inexorably further to the right. American recognition of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, the Trump administration's systematic assault on international law and the international consensus as these relate to the question of Palestine, and most recently, its recognition of Israel's annexation of the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, transformed the prospect of annexing the West Bank from a reckless ambition to a realistic opportunity. Netanyahu was, of course, delighted by these developments, and his government did everything it could to promote them. Indeed, it was Netanyahu who stated, in response to the Golan recognition, that it proves that territory acquired by force need not be relinquished to its legitimate owners. But we should also recognize that in this new geopolitical context, Netanyahu had no choice but to advocate annexation in order to avoid being outflanked by those on his right, who he could no longer dismiss as naive dilettantes. I, for one, have for more than a year been warning that under these circumstances, Israel's annexationist agenda was likely to be formalized once its election campaign got underway, and that is exactly what happened. Fifth, we now have a situation in which, one, the US president is already making support for Israel a cornerstone of his partisan warfare with the Democrats and his upcoming re-election campaign. Two, key members of Trump's national security team and a significant proportion of his base openly proclaimed that Trump was installed in the White House by none other than God in order to serve Israel. Three, US efforts to resolve the question of Palestine are led by an Inspector Clouseau, who fancies himself Detective Poirot, if not the reincarnation of Metternich, and who, along with his two aides, have for decades been invested in Israel's settlement project. You may recall that during his first visit to the White House, Netanyahu fondly reminisced about sleeping in Jared Kushner's bed. And Israel's growing army of annexationists, quite rightly, see the period between the Israeli parliamentary and American presidential elections as a golden opportunity for annexation that may not be repeated during their lifetimes. My sixth point is that Israel has many annexationist options. It is, at least initially, likely to focus on Area C, which, although comprising some 60% of the West Bank, would leave the great majority of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip under Palestinian rather than Israeli authority. If Israel indeed proceeds in this direction, it would be difficult, and I would argue politically untenable, for Palestinians to demand more extensive Israeli annexation and Israeli citizenship. There are, in any case, various other formulas through which Israel can seek to incorporate maximum territory with minimal Arabs. My seventh point is that this trajectory would not lead to the termination of the two-state settlement paradigm, but rather an Israeli-American attempt to reconfigure it in the following terms: a Palestinian entity based in the Gaza Strip, potentially incorporating several disjointed self-governing outposts in West Bank Palestinian population centers on the one hand, and in Israel incorporating most, perhaps all, of the West Bank. This is, I think, the two-state settlement that is unfolding before our eyes. This would be broadly consistent with what has already been implemented of Plan Kushner and would help explain Secretary of State Pompeo's recent refusal to express even the slightest concern at the prospect of Israeli annexation. Eighth, should this indeed come to pass, it would in many respects form the logical culmination of over half a century of Israeli occupation. Mix one measure of creeping annexation, add several helpings of Israeli impunity, and top it off with a very large portion of American indulgence and empty European posturing, and the reality we have today is precisely what you get. I would similarly argue that Trump's policies on the question of Palestine did not emerge from a vacuum, but rather build on various precedents adopted by Congress and previous administrations, but of course on steroids. Ninth, yet what do we mean with sweeping statements that Israel's election results have put paid to the two-state paradigm? To at least this Palestinian ear, it sounds like a clarion call, however inadvertently, for permanent occupation and acquiescence to annexation. Rather, it is precisely at this critical historical juncture that we must hold fast to the international consensus and international law. Given the current desultory state of the Palestinian national movement, Palestinians admittedly possess little more than what the late Edward W. Said termed the power of refusal. This means, first and foremost, categorically refusing to lie in the same bed in which Netanyahu has slept so comfortably, and refusing to engage in futile efforts to avoid blame for Plan Kushner's stillbirth. Absent Palestinian consent, it will be virtually impossible for even Israel and America's closest regional allies to formally engage with their designs. 10th, I would conclude with the observation that while this is of course about the question of Palestine, it is also about much more. The question of Palestine is being used as a battering ram to dismantle the global order, international institutions, international law, and indeed international treaties like the Iranian nuclear agreement. The appropriate response is to once again internationalize the question of Palestine by making it the litmus test for their survival and effectiveness. The ease or difficulty with which further Palestinian territory will be digested by Israel will be determined by the extent to which those who proclaim themselves guardians of the international order put their money where their mouth is. On a final note relating to politics in this country, the reason the question of Palestine has been chosen by the Trump administration as the battering ram of choice is because support for Israel has in recent decades enjoyed levels of bipartisan support other US allies can only dream of. Yet the negative response to Netanyahu's re-election by some prominent Democrats who have traditionally been silent when it comes to Palestinian rights is a potentially positive sign. Having said that, change does not self-generate and will require intensive and extensive effort, both here and abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Mouin. And now, I guess over the past week or so, no one has written more than Peter Beinart on trying to explain the lessons from these elections, and we're delighted that he's here to share his impressions with us on this topic. Please.
Thanks. So given that I know far less than the three people to my right about things on the ground among both Israelis or Palestinians, I'll talk about things closer to home, the impact in the United States. I think the big loser from Benjamin Netanyahu's re-election is AIPAC. The reason the big loser is AIPAC is that AIPAC is an organization that has to be bipartisan. The point of AIPAC is to bring the Democrats and Republican leaders from Congress together and for them to say the same thing. And its membership base also is based on being bipartisan. And it maintains its bipartisanship through the idea of the two-state solution, even if it's fictional. That's where you can create a bipartisan consensus around the idea, around the simultaneous idea, although these ideas are actually totally contradictory. The bipartisan consensus is built both on the idea that there should one day be a two-state solution and that the United States should never pressure Israel to actually do anything to bring about the two-state solution. That's the kind of construct which AIPAC operates, and it's through that it allows it to have a bipartisan coalition. The bipartisanship is already crumbling for cultural and sociological reasons inside the American Jewish community. The historic base of AIPAC has been a group of people I would call secular tribalists, which is people who are Jews who are not particularly religiously observant, but the core of their Jewish identity is the defense of the Jewish people. They may be fairly liberal when it comes to domestic issues, but they code switch. They change their prism when it comes to Israel to see things in terms of security and Jewish survival because of a certain narrative of Jewish history. The problem AIPAC has already been having is that it turns out that secular tribalist parents tend to give birth to secular universalist children, which is to say that the secularism continues in the face of America with kind of rapid American assimilation, but the tribalism, which is rooted in a historical experience and even a life experience of greater insecurity, closer to the Holocaust, memories of 1967, maybe some greater degree of social anti-Semitism, generally doesn't exist. This is the same reason the secular tribalists can't get their secular universalist kids to marry Jews, because the secular universalist kids are just much more universalistic, and so they take the parents' liberalism as applies to the United States, and they apply it in general, including to Israel, which either means their universalism makes them indifferent because Israel's just another country, why should we care any more about it than anything else, or it expresses itself in opposition, which is to say, we're going to oppose Israeli policies because they violate our liberalism. This was already a problem for AIPAC, a long-term structural problem, but Netanyahu's re-election and the fact that you don't have the figment of the two-state solution as much, I think hastens that process. Already AIPAC has been freaking out about the problem of keeping Democrats in the AIPAC's fold, and that will become more and more of a problem. A winner is a group like the Zionist Organization for America, ZOA, right? ZOA has already been growing in the Trump era. Why? Because ZOA doesn't have to be bipartisan. It doesn't have to pretend it supports the two-state solution. It doesn't have to pretend it likes Democrats. It doesn't have to pretend it's not bigoted towards Muslims. And its base is largely out of the Orthodox community. And in general, within the American Jewish organizational framework, what's happening is, as the secular universalist children don't follow their secular tribalist parents into the organizations, it's Orthodox kids who tend to go and increasingly are becoming the basis of the American Jewish organizations. To understand how culturally different American Jewish organizational life is from the way it was a few decades ago when Orthodox Jews were a much smaller percentage of the population, I like to tell a story that a friend of mine told me. A friend of mine was working in the 1970s for the Anti-Defamation League. It fights against anti-Semitism in the United States. He was an Orthodox Jew. In the winter, as you know, if you're Jewish, Shabbat starts early. The sun comes down early. So in the 1970s, he asked his boss at the Anti-Defamation League if he could leave early for Shabbat, leave work early for Shabbat. His boss said no. He said this was very odd because had he been working for anyone else, he would have called the Anti-Defamation League, but he was working at the Anti-Defamation League. This was the culture of American Jewish organizations several decades ago. Now it's completely transformed. Just look at how many people are putting on tefillin at morning minyan at AIPAC, right? It's a much, much more religiously based cultural environment. And that's a problem, though, for AIPAC because it's hard to keep those Orthodox Jews and liberal Democrats in the same institution. ZOA doesn't have to worry about that. It's firmly, everything in America is polarizing along ideological and partisan lines, and any institution that's trying to bridge that is in trouble, and ZOA is not trying to bridge that. The other big winner besides ZOA is Bernie Sanders. The reason Bernie Sanders is the winner is that Bernie Sanders is going to make a bet this presidential election. His bet is this, The Democratic candidates are moving left on absolutely everything they can possibly think of. But Israel is one issue on which the other candidates cannot move as far left as he can because they're anxious about the way it would rupture relationships between them and the organized American Jewish community. Sanders doesn't care. First of all, he has no relationship, basically, with even the mainstream Democratic Party institutions, let alone the organized American Jewish community. He can raise $1 billion online, and his people are very oppositional in their nature. And so I think their theory is that just as Trump saw in 2016, that there was a gap between where Republican elites were on trade and immigration and where the Republican Party base was, which he could leverage because he wasn't tied to the Republican Party elites. So he could take an anti-trade, anti-immigration policies, which the other candidates could not, that Sanders is going to try to do the same thing on Israel. He's going to go left of all the other candidates towards Israel. He's already on record, has said several times now, although it hasn't gotten as much attention, but it will, that he's in favor of some kind of cutting or conditioning of military aid. And I think although Elizabeth Warren will try to keep close to him, no other candidate will be able to go as far as he can, and many of the other mainstream candidates, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, will largely keep their head down on this issue. Sanders is going to run into the issue in a way that no presidential candidate, maybe since Jesse Jackson, really has. He's not going to abandon support for the two-state solution, but he's going to talk very explicitly about Palestinian rights. Not like Obama did, we're worried about losing the Jewish character of Israel. If you saw the videos he produced from Gaza last year, they're really unlike anything a major American politician has produced that I've ever seen. And I think Sanders is betting that it'll be a winning issue for him. And that will shift the debate. I mean, we've never really had a debate about military aid to Israel. But once you actually make it a debate inside the Democratic Party, it becomes difficult to oppose, right? I mean, Sanders just says, look, I don't think we should give $3.8 billion of unconditioned aid to anybody, let alone Benjamin Netanyahu, who my friend Beto O'Rourke here has already called a racist, right? That's part of the shift which has happened is Americans see other countries through the lens of our own leaders. So the problem for Benjamin Netanyahu, he is now seen on the left as America's Donald Trump. And because you can call Trump a racist, you can call Netanyahu a racist by extension. He's also increasingly seen as part of this authoritarian kind of alliance, right? So you can compare him to Orban and Bolsonaro and these guys. This is creating the room, I think, for Sanders to run, and I don't think the other candidates are really prepared for it. And once Sanders puts that on the table in a debate, what is the New York Times editorial page going to say? What is MSNBC going to say? They're not really going to be able to oppose that position. It's actually a popular position among Democrats. It's just never been a topic of discussion. And I think that will change the conversation in the Democratic Party permanently as other Democrats, especially in the age where you can raise money through small donors online, see Sanders as a model. We already have a generational gap. Even if you look at senators from the same state, two states with two Democratic senators, you always find that the younger of the two Democratic senators is more progressive on Israel than the older one. And we will see now that I think that'll have an impact on J Street. It'll push J Street from the left. Whether this affects things on the ground, I don't know. But I think that 2020 Democratic primary may be the most consequential debate on the subject of Israel that we've seen in my lifetime. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. I think to illustrate what Peter just mentioned, I was surprised yesterday to see a news item. It's not fully explained, but it says that J Street is willing now to consider some constraints on U.S. aid to Israel. That has never happened before, and it's worth waiting for the details. To conclude our panel, last but not least, is my good friend Phyllis Bennis will talk about U.S. policy and what's next in U.S.-Israeli relations. Phyllis.
Thanks, Khalil, and thank you, Peter, for a bit of optimism here. This is useful. Those of us in Jewish Voice for Peace who have taken these positions for a long time have been waiting for moments like this, and it's great to hear. I want to start very quickly with the notion of what the election of Benjamin Netanyahu did not mean. It does not mean the end of the two-state solution. It does not mean the end of Israeli democracy. It does not mean the end of uncritical U.S. support for the Israeli military. It does not mean an end to anti-Palestinian oppression. It doesn't change any of those things because they were already happening. In my view, the two-state solution has been over for a long time, not as a legal framework that people would like to point to, but as a reality on the ground. If we're talking about states, which implies certain things about legitimacy, about actual sovereignty, sovereignty over air, sovereignty over water, sovereignty over borders, sovereignty over the economy, sovereignty over who gets to come in and out. That was never on the agenda of what a two-state solution was going to look like. It was always going to be one state and a sort of entity over here, which was going to be a bit of Swiss cheese, a bit, you had all kinds of analogies of what it was not going to look like. So I think that we need to start with that. Settlement expansion was already underway. Jerusalem was already off the table in a realistic way. What we saw with this election was the consolidation of all of those things and the welcoming of all of those things by the US administration. And that is new. That is new. Not because the US was ever opposed to them in practice, but the rhetoric was different. The willingness to say, yeah, you're going to pass something like the new nation-state law as a basic law. That's fine with us. That's fine with us. We have no problem with that. So this shift to the right has been underway inside Israel as well as in the United States for a long time. I mean, it is true that Netanyahu has been, other than that, the one small party, Netanyahu was one of the furthest left of his government. Not because he had ever moved his right-wing positions, but because political reality in Israel had shifted so far to the right that it was now a coalition of the right, the far right, the extreme right, the furthest right, and potentially now the fascist right. So it's a very different scenario. And US support for all of those things have continued. Now, one thing that I think is very important is to see in this election, what were the gifts that Donald Trump gave to Netanyahu to ensure his election, right? Because all of these things that have been underway for generations, really, but there were some things that were very specific. We can start with the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. It wasn't only because Israel wanted it, but that was a huge component of how the mobilization occurred that led to the creation of a new alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia to shape an anti-Iran coalition in the region, and that had to start with the US withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. What we're hearing, the leaks we're hearing from the so-called peace plan, the deal of the century, that includes, as we've been hearing, the acceptance of settlers. There's not going to be a real state. A bunch of money was going to be the solution. Money coming from the Gulf, from somewhere else. That was going to, in Trump's view, pacify the Palestinians sufficiently so that the notion of statehood, the notion of a two-state solution, was simply off the agenda. The recognition of Jerusalem, moving the embassy, clearly designed to be able to enable Netanyahu to claim that he, more than any other Israeli politician, had not only the ear, but the largesse of the US president. The recognition of the basic law, the cutting of all US support for UNRWA, coupled with this extraordinary declaration that as of now, according to US officials, there are no Palestinian refugees except for a few thousand who have survived, who themselves were expelled in the Nakba, who were themselves the ones who left their homes carrying their keys as children, and who are now in their 70s and 80s and 90s. And that all of their descendants, the 5 million refugees registered with the United Nations, the United States knows better. We know they're not really refugees, so we don't have to worry about them. So refugees are taken off the position of being one of the final status issues. Jerusalem is now off the table as a final status issue. And then we have, of course, the Golan Heights, recognition of the Golan Heights. And on that one, Trump actually said that when he was talking to the Jewish Republican Coalition a week or two ago, and he got an extraordinary pass for his anti-Semitism on this one. He's speaking to this group of very right-wing, very wealthy US American Jews and says, I stood with your prime minister to recognize the Golan Heights as being under Israeli authority. So he's directly accusing them of dual allegiance. Now, what did Ilhan Omar just get raked over the coals for? What she didn't say was dual allegiance. Netanyahu is the one who made that possible for Trump to say it, right? So that's what we're looking at here. And then, of course, on the very eve of the election, 24 hours ahead of the election, the final gift from the Trump administration, the announcement that we are now considering the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a, quote, terrorist organization who will be subject to new sanctions that are going to further cripple the Iranian economy for ordinary Iranians. very much something that has been welcomed by Israel as part of its own anti-Iran position, and something that led Netanyahu to directly thank Trump for. And he said, "Thank you for responding to another of my important requests." Now, whether that's true or not is not the point. The point is that for an Israeli audience, he's claiming, and certainly no one in the White House denied, that the reason for that decision, the reason that the U.S. is now launching a new set of sanctions against Iran, further escalating the threat of war with Iran, was because there was a request from the Israeli prime minister. So thank you for that. And he also said, when he was at this meeting of the Jewish Republican Coalition, when he was talking about, this is Trump now, not Netanyahu, when he was talking about recognizing Jerusalem and moving the embassy to Jerusalem, he said directly that this was because of the request of his biggest funders, Sheldon and Miriam Adelson. And he said, and I quote here, "We got you something that you wanted. I can tell you, Sheldon and Miriam, that is the most important thing." So this notion that U.S. policy has at least partly been grounded in money is something that Trump is asserting without a moment's thought that there's something inherently anti-Semitic about that. Now, where does that compare with, again, with what Ilhan Omar was accused of that she didn't say? Her president, who has put her at extraordinary personal risk, she is now having to have armed guards because the death threats have gotten so intense, for false accusations of anti-Semitism, where Trump's real anti-Semitic statements move without a pass, without anyone noticing. They are not considered anti-Semitism, they're not problematic, and he is not getting death threats as a result of them, which is appropriate, he shouldn't. But that isn't the point. The point is he is making these statements without any understanding of the consequences. So finally, I want to look at, just briefly, a bit of the question of consequences. We've been all talking for years about the discourse shift in the United States on this issue. Peter just spoke to it again, Nadia spoke of it. And we know that it's been primarily emerging within public opinion. It's primarily generational. Young Jews have choices now that I never had when I was a young Jewish kid growing up. I worked in the Zionist movement because that's what there was. We didn't have any other options. There weren't other choices. We didn't have Jewish Voice for Peace. We didn't have J Street. We didn't have any of these choices. We didn't have If Now When, all of the other extraordinary movements of young Jews who were saying, no, you don't speak for me, AIPAC, and creating their own institutions. We didn't have that. They do, and they are taking advantage of it. It's not only in the Jewish community. It's among young African Americans. It's among young people in general. It's among the people of this country across the board. We're also seeing it in the media. The media shift is not as dramatic, but it's there. Just yesterday, Michelle Goldberg in the pages of the New York Times op-ed page, very casually talking about how anti-Zionists have the right of free speech. That was the headline. That's unprecedented. Not to speak of Michelle Alexander's extraordinary piece in the pages of the New York Times a couple of months ago, which I think you all remember. But where we have not been seeing it until now is inside the Beltway. We've seen bits and pieces here and there. We saw in 2015, we saw 60 members of Congress skip the speech when Netanyahu came to address a joint meeting of Congress and convince them not to allow the Iran nuclear deal to go through. 60 members, mainly from the Black Caucus, who said, this guy has been so racist towards our president, we're not going to go. That was huge, but it was kind of a one-off. We are not now seeing one-offs. We're now seeing a whole shift. Part of it is this issue of partisanship. Part of it is, it's true that only Bernie Sanders so far has taken the kind of position explicitly calling out the reality of what U.S. military aid supports, and in that context. But we saw 8 potential Democratic Congress candidates for president who didn't go to the AIPAC convention. That's never happened before. Candidates always show up. The big ones are invited to speak. The others run around trying to get on the cameras and look like they're important. This time, they didn't go. That was huge. So the big shift here, and I'll end with this, what we're looking at is not that these gifts from the Trump administration, that this new embrace of Israel, which is so much of a tighter embrace than we've ever seen at the rhetorical as well as the financial and political level, is not different. But what is different with that rhetorical shift is that we're changing US policy to the right in a way that's going to be very hard to reverse. And here's where I pull back from my usual more optimistic assessment of what it means that we have this shift in discourse. From now on, any future president is going to have to affirmatively say that the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps is not a terrorist organization. That's going to be harder than simply not saying what it is or isn't. We're going to have a president in the future who's going to have to say that Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights is a violation of international law. They haven't had to say that before. Now that Trump has said it's fine, somebody else to reverse it is going to have to go much further. Somebody's going to have to say that the US embassy does not belong in Jerusalem because Jerusalem does not belong only to the Jews. That's much harder than to say international law requires that we stay in Tel Aviv, where every other embassy has been. So it's going to make it harder. But we've set the stage for an extraordinary new period where these shifts in the public discourse, the media discourse, and now in the congressional and the electoral discourse is giving us a whole new set of possibilities, and that's what we need to be focusing on. Thank you.
Go ahead, clap. Thank you so much to all five panelists for your substantive and provocative presentations. And now we will spend the balance of our time in questions and answers. Please pass your cards on. Let me start with one while you're doing that. A couple of articles yesterday in Israel and here in the States talked about the weird relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, saying that most probably in this kind of weird relationship, Trump is expecting some kind of a payback now from Netanyahu. Do you guys bite into that? Do you think it's possible? Amir?
I think yes, but I'm not sure it has to do with policy questions. There has been one theory that because Trump has been so generous to Netanyahu, somehow Netanyahu will have to repay the favor with the American peace plan. I don't buy it. I think the real issue here is electoral politics that have to do with the next US elections. I think Trump and his political strategists are aware of the fact that he needs the evangelical vote to be as high as it was in 2016 in order to win re-election. And I think Netanyahu can help him with the evangelical vote, because if you have some evangelicals who might not like some of Trump's internal policies or just his style and his character, still his policies on Israel are a very strong selling point for that electorate, and that's a place where Netanyahu can help him. I don't expect Netanyahu to come out and basically, endorse him with a written statement, but just a meeting between them 2 months before the election in the White House, where they sit in front of the cameras and Netanyahu says, Trump has been Israel's greatest friend and we've never had a more friendly president. I think it will mean a lot to Trump. So I think when we talk about Netanyahu owing a favor to Trump after what we saw in the Israeli election, in my opinion, that's the direction we should be looking at, and not the peace plan, which I don't think is such a priority. If it comes out in June or July, it's going to be more than a year before the American election anyway. The real issue is going to be the evangelical vote in 2020.
Okay, Phyllis?
Just quickly on that, I think that's absolutely right, and I just would add to Peter's list of who won and who lost with this election. The other big winner in the United States with Netanyahu's election was CUFI, Christians United for Israel, the biggest of the evangelical right-wing Christian Zionist movements, whose leaders were present in Jerusalem when the U.S. announced its intention to move the embassy, et cetera. And these days, particularly in the Republican Party, where Trump has to keep up that level of pressure, they are far more influential than AIPAC. So what happens to AIPAC is far less significant for Trump's base than what happens to Kufi. And Kufi is doing great right now.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Ambassador Masoud Malouf for his patience, because he turned in the same question that before I got his card, asked the panelists. So great people think alike. Thank you very much. And the next question comes from Dan Raviv, I-24 News. For Nadia and Mouin, are you happy to see strong signs that many Democrats are in effect disillusioned by Israel, and perhaps it is mostly a reaction to Trump? Mouin and Nadia.
Am I pleased to see this development?
Yeah.
Of course. Of course, goes without saying. I think it was Peter or perhaps Phyllis who was pointing out that Israel's strength in this country has always been based on bipartisanship, and therefore I think it's a wonderful thing that it's beginning to crumble, at least at the edges. I think it's a process that will take a long time to translate into different policies and so on, but to see Israel become a partisan issue in this country, I think can only benefit the struggle for Palestinian self-determination.
I would just add to that that I think this is a fast-moving trend that we're seeing, very fast-moving. I agree with Peter in that Bernie Sanders will push it. I also want to say it just didn't come out of nowhere. There's a place for young people to go now, and not just young Jews, but also people of color, Palestinians, et cetera. There's many organizations, institutions that have been built up over the last 15 to 20 years to promote Palestinian rights that are now allied with all these other organizations. And as I said, they're far more resourced now and effective than they ever have been. So they've contributed a lot to this shift, which is indeed very welcome.
If I may just add, I think to give credit where it's due, I think Netanyahu during the final years of the Obama administration and Trump deserve easily 99% of the credit for this development.
Okay, the next question is from Greg Aftandilian. Although evangelical Christians critically support Israel, many other Christian denominations are showing sympathy with the Palestinians. Will these other Christian denominations in the U.S. carry weight in 2020? It's addressed to all speakers. Phyllis, you want to start with that?
Sure, I think that it's a very important question, and it is important to recognize that the evangelical right wing that has been so supportive of the most extreme violence of Israeli treatment of Palestinians is not the totality of Christian communities in this country or Protestant communities. And one of the things that we've seen is that, for example, the boycott movement, BDS, has gained enormous traction within mainstream denominations. The Methodists, the Presbyterians, the UCC, certainly the historic peace churches, the Quakers, the Mennonites, but even putting those aside, these other big mainstream churches that have, tens of millions of adherents across the United States have been taking up boycotts. Few or none of them, I think, have endorsed BDS per se, which is really the least important aspect, but they are taking up the action of, for example, looking at the need for human rights screens for the accounts, the investment accounts for their retirement funds, which are in the millions and billions of dollars in these churches. So I think this is huge, and I think it's having as big an impact or bigger in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, where the proportion of evangelical supporters of Israel is much higher. Among Democrats, that's not the case, but the vast majority of Democrats are not Jewish. The vast majority of Democrats are Christians, and they tend to come from these very large denominations that are moving much more quickly than in the past towards taking up real action to support Palestinian rights, not only rhetorically, but in real acts.
Peter, would you like to add to that?
I just think it's worth looking particularly at Iowa in this regard. Iowa is a state where the kind of peace churches, the kind of Northern European-based peace churches, Mennonites and others, have historically been strong. It's the state that produced Henry Wallace. It's a state where it's not really surprising that some of the members of Congress you see most pushing Palestinian rights tend to come from the upper northern Midwest, like Mark Pocan from Wisconsin or Betty McCollum from Minnesota. Iowa, among its Democrats, has a strong strand of that. It has very few military bases. Actually, Iowa tends to always been a state that's leaned left on issues of war and peace. And that's why I think it may be a state that's particularly amenable to the kind of line that Sanders is pushing.
Ghassan Rubez asks, should the Palestinians at this juncture demand a one-state solution with equal rights for all? Nadia?
Yeah. I think, before you can make demands, you have to build up your sources of power. Currently, the Palestinians on the ground don't have many sources of power that they can build up. They've been extremely fragmented. The Palestinian leadership has allowed them to be fragmented. The Palestinian citizens of Israel have stepped back from the power they managed to muster in the last election. So I think, however, there is a very strong push for rights on the ground by Palestinians. We want our human rights. And if people can go for human rights, and doesn't matter whether it's in one state or two states that these human rights are achieved, that would probably gain more traction, because that would be a civil society issue rather than a state power issue.
Okay, the next question is addressed to Amir from Rafid Jabouri, Al-Arabi TV. What is the most likely scenario? Is it a coalition between Netanyahu and blue and white, or blue and white forming a strong opposition, or what you discussed earlier, the coalition with the extreme right wing?
So first of all, I think at this point it's almost certain Netanyahu will build a right-wing religious coalition and blue and white will go to the opposition. I don't think that there is a big chance that blue and white would be willing to give Netanyahu what he wants, which is legal immunity. The most important issue for Netanyahu right now on the agenda is to either completely stop, or if that's not possible, significantly weaken the investigations and indictments around him. And that means some kind of a legislative change that would give him legal immunity as prime minister, or in the worst case scenario, allowing him to remain prime minister and go to court, and yes, sit as a defendant in court in the morning and then go in the afternoon to run the country, and take some steps to weaken the legal system, maybe weaken the judiciary in the process, so that he comes to this situation in a stronger position. I don't see blue and white agreeing to any of that. They ran a whole campaign basically saying our policies are not going to be very different than Netanyahu, but we are not going to bring corruption and we're not going to go after the rule of law. And so for them to go into a coalition with him would really be a complete reversal of everything they talked about during the election. There has been some speculation that one or two things could force a coalition government. One of them is the Trump peace plan, which again, if it includes any serious Israeli concession on any issue, maybe some of the other right-wing parties would leave Likud and he would need blue and white. I don't think that's a likely scenario. Everything I've seen from the Kushner, Greenblatt, Friedman effort points in the opposite direction, that it will be a plan tailored for the Israeli right wing. And eventually Netanyahu will be able to keep his coalition. And like I said, the bigger question will be the response in the Arab world. One other option, which again is slim, but it exists, I'm not going to completely count it out, is that the party of Avigdor Lieberman, which is a secular right-wing party that has 5 seats, will not be able to sit in the coalition with the ultra-Orthodox parties. If you do the mathematics, the entire right-wing religious bloc has 65 seats. Lieberman has 5. If he decides to bring the coalition negotiations to a place where it fails because he puts up such staunch secularist demands and the ultra-Orthodox reject them, then Netanyahu will not be able to form this kind of coalition and he will have to ask blue and white into the government. However, I don't think that's very scenario because the ultra-Orthodox are not stupid. They are actually the smartest players in the Israeli political system. And they will find a way eventually, negotiations run until the last minute. They will find a way to keep Lieberman inside the tent and do a government, and maybe they will give in, they will make some concessions to Lieberman in order to form this government, but they will want to keep blue and white in the opposition, because once there is a unity government on the table, the extortion power of the ultra-Orthodox parties will go down significantly. So in my view, the most likely scenario remains a right-wing religious coalition. Blue and white will have to learn how to fight in the opposition. It's a party made up of a number of former generals, so they've fought in the past, but it's different to fight in the Knesset. And we'll see if they're capable, if they're built for this.
The next question is from Anna. With millennials and other young voters changing their views, both in terms of US policy and views towards Israel, and anticipated changes in the 2020 elections, how do you view that as changing US traditional policy toward Israel?
What's hard to know, is how rapidly the change in public opinion and the change in and this kind of millennial youth activism. What we're seeing in American politics, which is transforming American politics in general, is a wave of youth-led activism that hasn't existed in the United States since the 1960s and 70s across a whole range of different issues and communities. And just like in the early 1970s, you saw that Beinart, which was the first American Jewish organization to support a two-state solution, came out of the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement. We now see that there is a Jewish kind of wing, like groups like If Not Now, and young people who are in J Street U and JVP and these other groups of this larger movement. And we also see the groups like Black Lives Matter and others that are focused on racial justice see a connection with the Palestinians. The question is, how much political power can those folks mobilize? And that partly has to do with how strong inside the Democratic Party, putting aside the Republican Party, where, as Phyllis said, it's almost unquestioned, how strong the forces that still have an AIPAC view are. They appear very formidable from the outside, because they're very, very long, deep-standing relationships with politicians that have been nurtured over a very, very long period of time. But sometimes when you look at these institutions from the inside among the Democrats, what I'm often struck when I spend time with folks and in that world is that there's actually, that it looks weaker from the inside than it does from the outside, partly because I think there's a lot of careerism, frankly, and a lot of people who privately to themselves at night when there are no cameras around actually don't really believe the things that their organizations are saying. I remember very distinctly a conversation I had with a person who works at an organization that is dedicated to fighting the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, Jewish organization. This person told me privately that they themselves do not buy products from the settlements in the West Bank. I remember a conversation I had once with a major prominent American Jewish leader who takes a very, very mainstream kind of quote-unquote standard pro-Israel view, who closed the door and said to me, Peter, I'm much luckier than you are. And I said, why? And this person said, because in 20 years, I won't have to see what's happened to Israel. I'll be dead. There is, I think, behind the scenes, and there are organizations like Encounter, for instance, which I think is actually having a really interesting, significant impact behind the scenes in the American Jewish community. Encounter is a group that takes American Jewish leaders to the West Bank to meet Palestinians. And many, again, most of these people are people who've never had any real significant experience with Palestinians. They've been to Israel 7,000 times, but they've never really had any experience of seeing what Palestinian life is like in the West Bank. They might have been taken to yell at Mahmoud Abbas once or twice, but they've never actually had that experience. And I know, just hearing again, people are shaken by that. And within institutions, it undermines the power of that perspective. So I think that potentially, as with other edifices that have looked very powerful, that ultimately we may find that it turned out not to be as powerful as it seems. Inside the Democratic Party. In the Republican Party, I think it's different.
Phyllis?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that the timing is a question. We never know when there's going to be a tipping point. Somebody said to me the other day, we're at a turning point. I don't know yet if it's a tipping point yet. And I think that's maybe an interesting way to put it. But we're not going to know when that tipping point has come. You know, they didn't know it in South Africa. They didn't know it in any of these situations where suddenly it emerges. I think that the key thing in looking at this difference in the role, if we look at AIPAC, for example, which is the model, if you will, of the Jewish component of the pro-Israel lobbies, AIPAC always had two things to bring to the table. It had huge amounts of money that it was dealing with very strategically. AIPAC is not a lobby. It doesn't donate to candidates, I know. But what it does do is gather the money from all of its supporters and a host of more than 100 other lobby groups, smaller ones, and it directs that money. It directs those funds to go to key candidates, usually not to support a candidate because they don't have to, but to threaten, if you don't toe the line, we will find and we will fund an opponent. Now, they only do that for candidates who they think are vulnerable. You know, that they don't do it for anybody who's got a solid base in their community. They don't want to lose. But the other thing that they historically brought to the table was votes. And that's what they don't have anymore, and everybody knows it. They still have the money, because in any community, you know, and now the Jewish community in the U.S. has a right, a left, and a center in a way that it never did before. Like any community, the majority of the money is with the right wing. There's a connection there. And they're older, right? So that's the generation that's not going to be around so much longer, and what happens to their funds, their children, exactly as what Peter was saying. But as a result, you can't say that they're bringing votes to the table now. They're just not. And that's going to play a role maybe in this election. I think we're going to see it. I don't think it's going to be determinative. But we are going to see it enough to say, okay, the next election, it's going to be a much bigger deal than we ever imagined before.
Thank you. Amir, did you want to add something?
Yeah, this is a general observation from what I see covering American politics about Israel, but also, you know, traveling a lot and speaking mainly in Jewish communities and meeting a lot of the people I think Peter is talking about. There is definitely a more complicated and even negative view in some circles about Israel. However, it's not always translated to more support of the Palestinians, because there are a lot of people who are disappointed with Israel, disappointed with the shift to the right and with Netanyahu. And I think, by the way, Trump has played an important role in this. One of my observations is that 2 years of the Netanyahu-Trump bromance has caused more damage to Israel's standing with certain American Jews than 52 years of the settlements and the occupation. Because I think for a lot of people, what happened between Netanyahu and Trump it made it so visual and obvious the changes that are happening in Israel. However, at the same time, people still look at what is happening on the ground. They look at Hamas firing rockets at Israeli towns and kibbutzim, and they look at the corruption that is happening with the Palestinian Authority. And Abbas, I don't think, passes as a very charismatic leader that people want to associate with and can kind of like motivate them to activism. So while it's true, I think, that you do see, and I'm not an expert on the broader Democratic Party, but definitely I think when it comes to the American Jewish community, you do see this trend of people who are moving away from Israel or disappointed or are hoping to be persuaded, but right now are very, very skeptical. It doesn't necessarily translate to a totally different view on the Palestinian issue or more motivation to be active on it, because, again, when they look at the situation on the ground, they also don't necessarily see something on the Palestinian side that they are feeling that they want to affiliate with.
Can I just add something just quickly? I think the other point, just to add to that, is that the impact of global anti-Semitism on the American Jewish community is very significant. So there might be, you may find American Jews who would say, Israel's gone in a direction that I find really, really appalling. But it was very, very difficult for them to give up on the idea of a Jewish state. When someone says, well, look at the Jews of France, they seem very imperiled and Israel is their place to go. That notion of a Zionism of refuge, even though very few American Jews would see it as necessary for themselves, when they look at Europe and the perception of, I think, reality of rising anti-Semitism there, that, I think, makes it very difficult for, not everyone, but makes it difficult for a certain group of people to go to shift their views as dramatically as some in the Palestinian solidarity movement might want them to.
All right, let's conclude with a couple of questions real quick, addressed to Amir and to Phyllis. The first one is from Josh Keating, Slate. In terms of the impact of this increased representation that a couple of you referred to of the Orthodox parties, what do you think would their input be on the new government in terms of actual practices and policies in Israel? And specifically, where do they come down on peace?
The ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah.
Well, it's a great question because the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel, the main priorities for them are sectorial priorities. Thanks, Khalil, again for the help over there. Sectorial interests, whether it's budgets to support their own education system, whether it's laws to exempt this population, big parts of it from military service, and of course religious legislation, laws that will keep the current situation in Israel, but there are all kinds of religious restrictions, and maybe even take it a step further and make life more frustrating for secular Jews and non-Jewish citizens. So that's the main priority. I think they also would like to see the weakening of the judicial system that Netanyahu and others in the right wing are looking for, because historically the Supreme Court of Israel has been a moderating force on these religious issues, and a lot of times you will see legislation that will pass the Knesset on these issues, and then the Supreme Court will intervene and say this is not constitutional. Of course, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but we have basic laws, we have the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and a lot of times the Supreme Court will come and intervene, and the religious parties, the ultra-Orthodox, would like to change that. When it comes to issues of war and peace, it's a more conflicted history, but there's actually been instances where the ultra-Orthodox parties played a moderating impact on this issue and supported peace negotiations and supported more moderate lines. I think this is especially true when it comes to the Shas party, which is led by Aryeh Deri. He was already in the government during the first Gulf War. If you go back and look what was written at the time, this was a Likud government, and there were missiles falling on Israel shot by Saddam Hussein, and he was pushing in the Security Cabinet not to retaliate and to respect the American request at the time that Israel will not strike back. And there have been other instances over the years that in closed-door sessions, when it's not in front of the cameras, he's been considered to be more moderate on these issues. I think if Netanyahu, this is a very, very, very theoretical option. I don't see it happening at all. But if we're talking here in, clearly theoretical terms, if Netanyahu decided tomorrow morning to change his direction and to go for a peace deal with the Palestinians, the ultra-Orthodox parties would not be his problem. They would not stand in his way. However, I also don't believe they would stand in his way if he decides to go for annexation and more right-wing moves, because at the end of the day, these are not their core priorities. They could be flexible enough to support peace if there was a government pushing that direction. They will also be flexible enough to accept his annexation and other moves as long as he keeps their priorities.
Would these views be shared among ultra-Orthodox American Jews that particularly mingle with this administration?
I think it's a little bit different. I think there's some parallels, but I think that the ultra-Orthodox communities in the U.S., which are concentrated in parts of New York and a couple of other areas, do not play as big a role politically as more secular and also the Reform and Conservative movements, but generally more secular Jews. In the one exception, and it has very little influence, is the Neturei Karta, who are widely known for showing up at the protest with their hats and the payas and the whole deal. But they're not taken seriously by most Jews. They're anachronistic, and their opposition to Israel is not based on human rights or support for Palestinian rights as much as it is based on a view that says that the Messiah has not yet come and told us that this is the time for Jews to be ingathered in Israel, and until it does, it's a sin for Israel to be created, and so they're opposed to it. They're not a serious political force. I think that where there is some intersection, and it is similar to what Amir is just saying about the situation inside Israel, it is similar in that there's a lot of alliance with the right-wing Christian fundamentalists in certain communities, as well as with some Muslim communities where the issues are social issues, anti-abortion, modest dress, suppression of women's rights. All of that is something that they share. And in some areas, that will become, I think, their relationship is more likely to merge with Kufi than it is with AIPAC. So I don't think they're a major force in the US political scene, at least at this point.
When we talk about Orthodox Jews in the United States in terms of Israel, we're really talking about modern Orthodox Jews. We're talking about people who in Israel would be called Sorry?
I was talking about the
Yes, I know. That's
Yeah,
what
yeah.
I'm saying. That the
Yeah, you're
ultra-Orthodox
right.
Jews are not
Yeah,
really
yeah.
significant players here. We're talking about people who in Israel would be called Dati or Dati Lumi, Kippah Shugra, that kind of.
John Anderson asked earlier a question about Gaza. Just out of respect for that question, Amir, you mentioned to me before we started the event that you think the situation in Gaza is about or could explode and could impact the process, the political process in Israel. Could you take 1 minute to just elaborate on that?
I think that before the election, Netanyahu and Hamas reached some kind of a quiet deal to keep down some of the tensions. I don't know if that deal is stable. I don't know if the next coalition that Netanyahu is planning to build will give him the space, the flexibility he needs in order to keep it in place. I know that there is a lot of impatience in Gaza, and it's true that this deal that they reached did take down some of the pressure, but the core problems remain. The unemployment and poverty and just the lack of any hope for a better situation. And I think if this deal does not hold in the next few weeks, we could go back to the danger of escalation we had right before the election. And that could also cause serious complications for whatever Trump, Kushner, Greenblatt are trying to do.
I think Mouin was trying to get.
Yeah, please.
I'll just say there's been a consistent pattern over the past decades where there have been informal or less informal deals of an end to hostilities in exchange for an easing or removal of parts of the blockade. And we've seen basically two incompatible approaches where Israel's deal on offer is essentially quiet for quiet and seems to always systematically renege on any commitments it has made regarding easing the blockade. And this is sending the message to Hamas, and I think we've seen it quite clearly in the past few months, that if you want anything, you have to fire rockets. Otherwise, no one pays attention to you. And therefore, I would agree with you that even if an agreement is reached, I mean, there's always two issues. First, you have to reach an agreement, and comes a bigger challenge of actually seeing it implemented. And I think particularly everything that's been said today about the composition of the next Israeli government, I rate the chances of meaningful implementation very low.
Yeah, and agreements do get reached despite of denials. As a matter of fact, just the last 24 hours, I mean, some of you have heard that an agreement was reached between Israel and Hamas over the prisoners issue, the strike, and that has been signed last night. At any rate, the Middle East and Arab-Israeli affairs are never boring, and the presentations today proved that we are about to enter a very exciting period in the region, for better or for worse. And so please stay tuned, and we hope to see you at a future event. Please help me thank our panelists for their presentation.